Hello, and welcome back to the Conservation Essentials Step 4 of the Conservation Standards course. This is our last module. Again, this course focuses on the Analyze and Adapt step of the Conservation Standards and will provide you with vital skills for using monitoring data and new information to adapt as needed and improve your conservation efforts. In Module 6, we'll learn about preparing to share learning. This module highlights the importance of sharing what you've learned through your data analysis and reflection. We know that to really improve the way conservation happens and to achieve great impact, we need to foster a culture of learning and share our learning widely. This module will help you identify your audiences, consider the information they need, and how to best reach them. This module's learning objectives are to ensure that you can identify the different information needs and preferred communication modes and materials for sharing your learning with key audiences, and to ensure that you understand the basics of Step 5 in the Conservation Standards. This course focuses on Step 4. During this final module, we'll round out Step 4 and start discussing parts of Step 5. As you recall from previous modules, in the Analyze and Adapt step, we prepare data, analyze results, and adapt our plans accordingly. This module focuses on the final bullet point in this step, Adapt Plans, and transitions us into Step 5, where we document, share, and foster learning. You've tracked your progress, written out your progress in report format, and used those details to make and justify adaptive management decisions. This may be enough for your team to adjust your implementation, but how will you communicate it with those who are not involved in the process? Some audiences you should think about communicating your results to include senior management within your organization, key partners that may or may not have been involved in your decision making but would like to be informed of the changes, stakeholders who have contributed to the process along the way but would like to know the final outcome, donors supporting your project, and the broader conservation community can also benefit from hearing about your results and learning. This starts to get to the Conservation Standards Step 5, where we share lessons and learning for the benefit of the conservation projects across the globe. Think about each of your audiences and what specifically they need to know. Your organization's senior management may want to know the high-level summary of how the project is progressing. What are your project's major issues overall? Note if there's anything they need to be working on at their level, such as allocating resources differently, hiring new staff, and so on. What are some great success stories that you'd like to tell? You may be aware of some good publicity for your organization or project. Finally, what could be replicated to other projects that your organization is implementing elsewhere? The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation began its Andes Amazon Initiative, or AAI, in 2003 with a goal to conserve the ecological viability and aquatic and terrestrial biodiversity of the basin. In 2020, they hired a consultant to carry out an external evaluation to assess how the initiative was contributing to its ultimate goals with the evolving environmental context currently facing the world. The evaluation provided many lessons on AAI's impact in the region, what was working, what wasn't, and how it could be improved moving forward. The evaluation also shared findings from the monitoring system assessment. Monitoring data is entered at the project level, then rolled up to the program level. That data can be compared across projects in the region and across programs at the Moore Foundation. The monitoring system assessment concluded that AAI has clear, measurable goals and objectives for their strategies. It also found that the initiative strategy documents, measurement, evaluation, and learning plan, Meraki files, the monitoring data, and the internal strategic review documents, quote, all reflect a strong situation analysis and a process of continuous reflection on the situation in the Amazon as it changes, end quote. By clearly reporting data in a digestible form, the senior management are able to start with high-level summaries, then dig into the details where relevant or needed. More information on this example is available in the supplemental readings for the course. Key partners associated with or involved in your project will also want a summary of how the project is progressing. They might be someone implementing the project with you or someone you might work with in the area to achieve complementary goals. What are your major issues overall and what's going well? And they'll need to know what their team or organization will be doing differently based on any changes to your project. Ideally, these key partners were involved with the Reflect and Adapt process to some extent, and your communications with them will be the confirmation of those changes that you already agreed upon together. In Tanzania, the Jane Goodall Institute, or JGI, partnered with Pathfinder International and RTI International on the Landscape Conservation in Western Tanzania project. JGI held annual Reflect and Adapt sessions to check in on their progress towards implementation and achievement of results. JGI encouraged the participation of their partners in the annual Reflect and Adapt activities to ensure that the partners were aware of the thinking behind the eventual changes to the project implementation. The JGI team would then make updates to the project plans and share those updates with their public health, Pathfinder, and community health workers, and research, RTI, partners to ensure that they were up to date on the newest thinking and changes to the implementation that may affect those partners. This team did two major things to ensure their partners were aware of the changes. One, they included their partners in a Reflect and Adapt process. And two, they shared updated plans for review with their partners before beginning that year's implementation cycle. If you're unable to include partners in a Reflect and Adapt process, ensure you've given your partners ample time to review proposed changes to the annual plans for the year, and do your best to integrate their thinking into the planning documents. Stakeholders likely contributed to the Reflect and Adapt process along the way, but they will like to know the final outcome. These individuals are within your project scope that are impacted by your project. Let them know what you were able to incorporate from their input. Be honest about what you did not include and how you can continue to work together to address their questions or concerns, or why their input is beyond the manageable interest of your project at this time. The Puget Sound Partnership tracks the status of their indicators and shares those indicators with the Puget Sound community. They call their indicators the Puget Sound Vital Signs, which are measures of ecosystem health that guide the assessment of progress toward their 6 recovery goals. Their team expresses each of the 6 recovery goals with one or more vital signs that represent important components of the ecosystem. Vital signs include measures of human well-being that illustrate the human or social impacts of ecosystem health in the Puget Sound region. An example of such measures is the number of jobs in natural resource sectors. Using the most recent data, they reported on whether or not the targets for their vital signs set for the year 2020 were achieved, and shared that through a public report and website. Sharing this progress creates awareness within the Puget Sound community, including different organizations and businesses that use resources or benefit from healthy ecosystems. These data allow the community to make informed decisions about how they use and interact with their environment, and the impact those decisions have both on the environment and the human well-being in the area. You can find out more and read the report at stateofthesound.wa.gov. Donors supporting your project may even request that you carry out these Reflect and Adapt processes. If they've requested it, they may have explicit guidance on what they expect to hear from you about the process. Whether they've requested it or not, it's helpful to provide them with a high-level summary of the process, including major changes. Sharing major changes with your donor can support your team to justify that for your project. Success stories. It may be exciting for them to share these for publicity purposes or to raise awareness about the project and perhaps garner more support. Perhaps your funding is contingent upon certain outcomes that you agreed upon with the donor. Has something changed that may suggest you won't achieve those outcomes, but may be working towards different, more likely outcomes? You should clearly write this out with justification so that you and your donor can chart the best path forward depending on your obligations to the funding. If you yourself work for a donor, remember to foster a learning environment where it's safe for projects to share their failures with you as well as their successes. This fosters learning for the broader conservation community as well. Remember our Nepal example from Module 5? They had major changes to scope, going from over 100 watersheds to just 8. They also had to make changes based on a recent government restructuring. The team was able to share their proposed changes with the donor funding their project and shift their project scope and goals because they had clear and documented justification behind each of their proposed adjustments. Their donors were willing to work with them at the time to adjust their contractual obligations thanks to their detailed documentation. The broader conservation community can also benefit from hearing about your results and learning. This includes organizations near to and far from your project. You may find yourself sharing to the wider community through communities of practice, such as CMP, IUCN specialist groups, or other collaborative learning initiatives and programs. These communities of practice can be a great place to share your work. We'll provide some examples and talk more about them and Step 5 next. Now let's start exploring Step 5, where you document and share what you learn and foster a learning environment. There are many reasons why it's important to share what you've learned while implementing your conservation project or program. Conservation means we're working in complex systems where different actions may work better or worse in different contexts. Sharing what works under what conditions can help similar teams across the globe to calibrate their work in their context, thus improving the effectiveness of conservation overall. It's also important to share how you've used the conservation standards themselves, as this can lead to more sharing and more learning in a field where the stakes are high and the timeline is urgent. To get to a point where we're sharing our learning, we must first foster a learning environment within our project and organization. Learning requires leaders and donors who understand the need to allocate resources from immediate action to the long-term work of evidence-based conservation and adaptive management. If you're in a leadership or donor role, consider how you can increase the resources available for a project team to learn from their work. We often hear stories about what worked well, from our internal meetings and our progress reports to national publicity on a conservation success story. While these can be helpful to show us what works in certain cases, it's vitally important that we share what isn't working if we want to make a conservation impact. Ask for learning spaces such as meetings, annual check-ins, working groups, and conferences focused on learning. If you're in a leadership role, setting up one of those spaces is one way you can foster learning. You can also ensure that your team has the budget for such events. If your organization can't make their own learning spaces, ask for funding or allocate funding if you're the person to do so, to go to larger learning events or join a collaborative learning group. We'll talk about these types of learning spaces next. Sharing your lessons and contributing to the global evidence base requires the following considerations. We'll talk about each point, but let's start with common templates. First, use common templates such as generic theories of change that allow you to compare results from using similar strategies to address similar threats in different contexts. Share learning from a specific project to learn across multiple project sites. As you can see in this example, two specific theories of change for the same strategy focused on community guards or patrols were used to create a generic theory of change for community patrols and guards, one from a pangolin project and the other from a sea turtle project. This can be used to learn across multiple sites. As a community, conservationists have an opportunity to share data on similar results to better understand what works best and under what conditions, making it easier to design more effective conservation projects. Here's another example of a common template. This generic theory of change was developed through a collaborative learning group supported by USAID's Measuring Impact project. We'll talk more about learning groups in a few slides. This generic theory of change looks at one of the most common conservation strategies, conservation enterprises, also known as alternative livelihoods. One of the most interesting products to come from this generic TOC is a document called The Nature of Conservation Enterprises, a 20-year retrospective evaluation of the theory of change behind this widely used approach in biodiversity conservation. The author uses a theory of change to examine the assumptions and draw lessons learned on the conditions needed for enterprise and conservation sustainability from 6 sites across the globe. Each of the 6 sites has used a conservation enterprise strategy to conserve biodiversity. The document explores the projects along the theory of change and highlights the conditions where conservation results are or are not being achieved and why. A lot of work has come from this generic TOC, and you can read all about it on biodiversitylinks.org. Once you've set yourself up with a common template, you can think about the 4 following steps. Manage and document your data with an eye towards sharing, report both successes and failures, make contribution to the evidence base part of the regular routine for your project, and encourage others to contribute their information to the evidence base as well. There are many formats to share your learning and various channels to share it through. Since you have your learning set up in a generic template, you can contribute it to an evidence library. Some examples of evidence libraries include Conservation Evidence and CAMEL on Marathi Share, CAMEL being the Conservation Actions and Measures Library. Peer-reviewed articles are a great way to share learning experiences using similar formatting. For example, the Conservation Science and Practice Journal of the Society for Conservation Biology is currently running a series called Generic Theories of Change for Conservation Strategies, a new series supporting evidence-based conservation practice. Learning can be documented in many more ways than what we've just outlined, including internal documents. You might have a short write-up that cites evidence from your project, or you might have a more detailed document that's not peer-reviewed, what you might call gray literature. You might even consider a video or a photo story. However your learning is documented, you then need to start thinking about where you want to share it. We call these dissemination channels. So we spoke about communities of practice earlier in the module. These groups are great places to share your learning, however you documented it. You might partner with these groups to get wider reach to the exact audiences that will find your work most useful. The Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP, is a community of conservation-oriented NGOs, government agencies, funders, and private businesses that work collectively to guide conservation around the world. As stewards of the conservation standards, CMP seeks better ways to design, manage, and measure the impacts of conservation action. The Conservation Coaches Network, or CCNet, is a global community of trained professional coaches that use the conservation standards to strengthen conservation action and results around the world. Both CMP and CCNet are communities of practice built around using the conservation standards. Let's talk a little bit about working groups as well. IUCN's Conservation Planning Specialist Group, or CPSG, aims to save threatened species by increasing the effectiveness of conservation efforts worldwide. They use scientifically sound, collaborative processes that bring together people with diverse perspectives and knowledge to catalyze positive conservation change. IUCN also has a World Commission on Protected Areas, or WCPA. They develop knowledge-based policy, advice, and guidance on the full suite of issues surrounding protected areas through the establishment of specialist groups and task forces. They bring together global experts to find solutions for program priorities, including global protected area standards and best practice guidelines. Large donors often facilitate collaborative learning groups, such as USAID's Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group. USAID also has a series of collaborative learning groups, currently including conservation enterprises, combating wildlife trafficking, marine conservation and sustainable fisheries, and wild meat, as well as 2 regional groups that focus on private sector engagement and combating wildlife crime in Latin America. The theory of change we discussed from the Conservation Enterprise Retrospective was developed as part of this learning group. Collaborative learning groups or initiatives may spring from communities of practice such as CMP and CCNet. Communities of practice and collaborative learning groups often host webinar series. You can seek out these opportunities and ask to present to groups who are focused on your conservation topic or region. Check out the joint CMP Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation mini webinar series, which covers a wide range of conservation topics, including justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the conservation standards, holistic approaches for healthy and resilient social ecological systems, and population health environment, just to name a few. Topical groups may cover specific strategies or conservation targets. So you might find a whole series focused on the best strategies for combating wildlife traffic in Asia or supporting protected areas in Europe. Your work in most formats can be shared at conferences. For example, international conferences like the Society for Conservation Biology's International Conservation Congress and IUCN's World Conservation Congress are great conferences to share just about any conservation topic. You can share a poster, be a speaker, set up a campus session, or even share short videos. These conferences continue to innovate and provide new ways for folks to share. Topical conferences are also great to reach the specific audience that is most relevant for your work. Consider the United Nations Climate Change Summit, for example. These conferences are great venues for cross-topic and even cross-generational learning. So to recap what we've covered in this presentation, it's important to share what you've learned through your data analysis and reflection. It's important to foster a culture of learning and sharing our learning widely to improve the way conservation happens and to achieve the greatest impact. We've discussed how to identify your audiences, consider the information that they need, and how to best reach them. The most important thing is to strive to share and create a culture of learning and sharing.